In this video, we'll take a look at a VPC peering relationship and how it affects DNS. So let's start by going to our VPC area of the AWS console. And again, I'm still here in the Stockholm region, and I have my two VPCs, my Rick Demo VPC and my second VPC. And I'm going to make a couple changes within this second VPC. Number one, I'm going to go to subnets. And for my second VPC public subnet, I just want to point out that I made a little configuration change here. Under Modify Auto Assign IP Settings, I have now enabled that feature. So if you're following along at home, enable the automatic assignment of public IP addresses in this subnet, in your second VPC public subnet. And then let's go to our VPCs. And in the second VPC, I'm going to select it. I'm going to go to Actions, and I'm going to edit DNS host names. And I am going to enable DNS host names. And so my objective here is to get a public DNS host name assigned to my EC2 instances. So let's go to the home screen of the AWS console, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's go to EC2. And you can see I've got 4 instances running here, 2 of which are my Bastion hosts. So here's my Bastion host in VPC 1. And I can see that the Bastion host in VPC 1 has a public IP. It does not have a public IP version for DNS. Now let's take a look at the Bastion host in VPC 2. And because I made that configuration change, now this one has a DNS host name. So I should be able to resolve this DNS record on the internet and connect to this particular EC2 instance. Now, if you're making this change in your own AWS account, you're going to want to wait about 24 hours and allow this DNS record to propagate. So if you're following along at home and you've just made the same changes that I've made, go ahead and pause this video and come back tomorrow. Give it about 24 hours, allow that DNS record to propagate throughout the internet, and then we can continue following along. Okay. So now I've actually waited about 2 hours, and it looks like my DNS record is propagated. So let's try this out. Here is the public DNS name of my Bastion host in VPC 2. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually launch an RDP session to my Bastion host in VPC 1 and attempt to resolve this address. So at the command prompt here in my Bastion host from VPC 1, I'm going to type in the ns lookup command, and then I'm going to paste in the DNS name for that EC2 instance. And I'm going to perform a DNS query and try to find out the IP address associated with that EC2 instance. And here's the result for my DNS query, 13.51.86.24. And that is actually the public IP address of this EC2 instance. So I'm getting a DNS result. When I query this public DNS record, I'm getting back this public IP address. But what I want to bear in mind is that Bastion host VPC 1 is in a VPC that has a VPC peering connection to VPC 2. So do I really want that traffic flowing over the public internet? If this Bastion host is attempting to communicate with this Bastion host, ideally that traffic would flow over the VPC peering connection. It wouldn't go to this public IP, and it wouldn't flow over the internet. It would utilize the private IP and the VPC peering connection in an ideal situation. So the private IP address of the Bastion host in VPC 2 is 10.2.1.158. So let's go back to our RDP connection. And here I am at the Bastion host in VPC 1. and I'm going to try to ping the private address of the Bastion host in VPC2. And look at that, it works just fine. That traffic is flowing over the VPC peering connection. It's not flowing over the public internet. So that's the problem with DNS here. I'm in the Bastion host in VPC1. I'm trying to reach the Bastion host that is in VPC2. And if I try to reach it by its DNS name, that DNS query is returning the public IP address, which is reachable over the internet. But that really defeats the purpose of the VPC peering connection. We should be connecting to this instance using its private IP, not its public IP address. So how do we resolve this issue? Well, let's go to the home screen of the AWS console. And let's navigate back to VPC. And let's take a look at our peering connection. And so here are my peering connections. Here's the peering connection that we've created. And notice within the peering connection configuration, there's a section for DNS. And we can see that DNS resolution from acceptor VPC to private IP is disabled. And in reverse, DNS resolution from requester VPC to private IP is also disabled. So the result is DNS resolution to private IP addresses in both directions is currently disabled. So let's make a change here. I'm going to go to Actions. I'm going to edit my DNS settings. And what I want to do is I want to allow the requester VPC to resolve DNS of the acceptor VPC. And if you watched my previous video, the requester VPC was VPC1. It was that RIC demo VPC. The acceptor was the second VPC that I created just to demonstrate VPC peering. So Bastion host 1 is in the requester VPC, and I want it to be able to resolve the DNS of Bastion host 2, which is in the acceptor VPC, but I want it to resolve to the private IP address, not the public IP. Now, I could also allow this in both directions, but I'm just going to allow it in one direction to really clearly point out what's going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and save these settings. And now you can see DNS resolution from requester VPC to private IP is enabled. So let's go back to the Bastion host in VPC1. And what I'm going to do first off is I'm just going to type in the command ipconfig/flush DNS to clear out any DNS resolver cache data. Right? I don't want this record that we found before still existing in the DNS cache. And then I'm just going to hit up arrow a couple times, and I'm going to perform an NS lookup again and see what address returns. And so we can see at the moment there's no change. We're still getting the public IP address back. So I'm going to flush DNS one more time here. And we're going to just pause this recording for a little while and see how long it takes for this DNS entry to get updated.